Hey, my name's Angela, and the presentation I have for you all is about death metal and grindcore. And the band I will be covering specifically is Asking Alexandria. Metalcore, grindcore, and death metal. I remember when I was barely getting into music, learning about these different types of metals and cores were super interesting, and they're all very different. Um, the subgenres which metalcore and grindcore come from are from death metal, and this is a type of metal that's fueled with anger and violence, and the sounds of it very much translate that through growls and aggression, loud guitars, drumming. Um, Death metal began in California, and the band Possessed helped jumpstart that. Um, Along with the popular band Death, but they were formed in Florida, and they are the band that is known to have perfected death metal because of their brutal riffs and guitar sounds. Um, Death metal originated from thrash metal, and thrash metal artists, um, one that we read about was like Metallica, and another thrash metal artist is Cannibal Corpse as well. Um, Grindcore stems from death metal, and it has the speed of thrash metal, the growls from death metal, and the energy of hardcore punk. So it's pretty intense. There's a lot going on. And these genres definitely reflected um, anger, hopelessness, and the depression youths were experiencing during the 80s and 90s. Um, these acts were visually uh, they were visually interesting to watch when these bands would perform live. Um, there was a lot of violence and self harm acts. Some bands would cut themselves on stage. Um, there were aggressive mosh pits. Um, these were all sort of the generation of youths feeling confused and feeling like they can fit in with a crowd, but at the same time not doing it in the best way or the healthiest acts for themselves. I have a few pictures here just to show you the basic idea of death metal and metalcore, and the imagery is fairly dark, lots of red, black, blues, um, definitely gory. You can see up at the top right, I have a Cannibal Corpse album, and that is very gory. I also have a band that is not a US band. Um, I believe they're Swedish. Don't quote me on that, but I really like them. Demu Borger, and their music is definitely on the darker side, if not more considered black metal, but it also fits into the category of death metal. And the picture of the band to the right, this is actually them. Um, some bands in the earlier 80s and 90s either did the theatricals with the makeup, um, black clothing, spikes, um, and some bands just kept it simple, and the trend color was mainly black. Um, Most of the imagery was not meant to be cheerful or happy. It was just very darker and scarier and very appealing to the eye in a way. Very artsy, but not the type of art that anyone can just look at and tolerate necessarily. So with this assignment, the first band that came to mind when thinking about this was Asking Alexandria, and they're a metalcore band. I personally still listen to them to this day. I first had discovered them in 2008, and their breakthrough was in 2009. Although you may see online it may be 2011, but I think it's 2009. And their breakthrough was in the US. They're originally from the United Kingdom. They are specifically screamo and metalcore with some elements of EDM in their music. Their breakthrough album was Stand Up and Scream. Um, it was very much so a lot of screaming in that album. It's a very special album. It's honestly one of the albums from years ago I still go back to this day. And thinking about the music scene is that in that time is very nostalgic. Um, they were different. They were one of the bands to really bring metalcore back up into popularity, along with subgenres and bands that could relate to them in sound, but also didn't relate to them in sound, which was very interesting. And a lot of the bands that I have listed below don't sound similar to them at all, nor do they sound similar to each other, which is also interesting. Um, a lot of the styles of these bands, including Asking Alexandria, was the emo scene, hairstyle, and clothing. Long hair that was styled, covering faces. Usually it was straightened with a straightener. Um, it would be cut very not evenly, not cleanly, to have more of a spiked look. Band t-shirts, skinny jeans, typically wore Vans. Um, most of these bands, actually all of these bands, for the most part, have had male members as well. Um, and um, the lyrical content, I specifically wrote about the lyrical content of Asking Alexandria, and their content was related to drugs, women, relationships, either personal, like intimate, but also friendships and just mistakes. Um, but these other bands do talk more about um, just a few of those same things, just more concentrated. Like Bring Me the Horizon definitely talks more about just living everyday life, the rock and roll lifestyle, but also a little bit of a storytelling type of content. Of Mice and Men is definitely more relating to emotional family, um, reflection of the self. Uh, and Black Veil Brides was definitely one of the bigger bands that was surfing on a ride to stardom with Asking Alexandria, because they were a band that had more of a theatrical look compared to these other bands. And they also definitely had a large following because their lyrics were so relatable to many youth who were depressed and confused. They didn't have a stable household, and those that content for lyrics and creation have definitely still lingered from early in the 80s and 90s to still now. And as I mentioned, paved the way for other related genres and bands like post-hardcore, Sleeping with Sirens, Enter Shikari, Pierce the Veil. They're all very different from each other. And this also shifted the acts of bands on the Vans Warped Tour. Typically, the Vans Warped Tour was very pop punky, with bands like Green Day, Sum 41, Blink 182. And this the last few years before the Vans Warped Tour ended, it became much more metalcore dominated. These bands that I have mentioned were almost all regulars pretty often. And it was a definite dramatic shift, which was very interesting. I have pictures of a few bands. The top left corner is Bring Me the Horizon. The bottom left corner is Suicide Silence. The top right corner is Sleeping with Sirens, and the bottom right corner is Black Veil Brides. Besides the exception of, with the inclusion of Black Veil Brides, excuse me, um, Sleeping with Sirens, Bring Me the Horizon, and Suicide Silence, there are trends that they all have the t-shirts, tattoos, longer hair, all male, and typically not many bright colors are used in their marketing or band group pictures. Definitely more than black now, but uh, you don't really see as much of the leather and spikes. It's more skinny jeans. Vans. Sleeping with Sirens really wore a lot of Toms, to be honest, as far as shoes. But you see much more t-shirts, other band t-shirts support. With the exception of Black Veil Brides, as I mentioned, they are definitely more of a theatrical act in their earlier years. Now they become a little more mainstream and have cleaned up, wear less makeup, wear a little more leather, don't use as much body paint, but they definitely were influenced by Kiss. And that concludes it for me with this presentation. Hope you enjoyed.